that's very intentional, the way I wrote the book and structured it, and I thought it would be of greater service to the church ultimately. Now, there are many other books that are introductions to the theology of Karl Rahner, and they're going to do a better job of that than I can, because they're written by people who are Catholics and very sympathetic to his theology. And so you don't need to write another one of those books and just make it worthwhile just because a Reformed person wrote it. It doesn't make sense for me to duplicate somebody else's book. So that's one reason why I didn't want to do that. But you might expect in a series like this on Great Thinkers that, oh, well, let's flip open and there's a chapter on anonymous Christianity. And then there's another chapter on the doctrine of the Trinity. And when you go there, it's just, very descriptive nuts and bolts. Well, here's his doctrine. Here's the abstract version, the synopsis, and that can be useful to have dictionaries of theology or encyclopedias of theology. But I wanted to do something more than that, because if you try to pull Rahner's doctrines out of their context and just understand them, if you're looking for a Cliff Notes version, you're not going to understand what he's really saying. You're going to be able to repeat it at a cocktail party, at least if you go to those kinds of cocktail parties, right, guys? They're talking about stuff like that. And you're going to sound like you know what you're talking about, but you're basically at best going to get like a PhD comprehensive exam level understanding, which is like, it's like a book report, right? Like I can regurgitate to you something somebody said, but I'm not going to own it. And so I wanted to write a book where you could pick this book up, read the first chapter and the last chapter, and it would, I think, be really useful to you. And the whole case is laid out in the first chapter and the last chapter, like everything in a summary form. So if you need something really fast, you can read the book that way. But if you want to understand things really deeply and to get a hold on what Rahner is actually doing, and then really understand the true genius and the insight of his theology, I disagree with it vehemently, but if you really want to understand why he's such a formidable foe to the Reformed Church and the Reformed faith, you have to get into it, and then you see the whole system. Now, a lot of Rahnerians would really reject the idea that Rahner's a systematic theologian, but that's because they have very technical views on what dogmatics is versus ethical theology versus philosophical theology and stuff. So Rahner's not a systematician in that kind of sense. He's not doing traditional dogmatic theology in the form that they know and understand. And in many ways, he's very critical of that. He calls it textbook or Denzinger theology, named after a very classic book on Orthodox or traditional Catholic doctrines. But what Rahner does is present, I believe, a very singular project. He has a very simple root concern, a basic question of existence that he carries on from beginning to end, and it goes through all the different loci or the different departments of theology. And that question really is, who is mankind and how is God communicating himself to mankind? And what's the future of that relationship? So in many ways, that question is the same question we want to ask in terms of the deeper Protestant conception, in terms of classic Orthodox traditional and confessional covenant theology. That is the question. Who are we and why are we here? And what's the future of our relationship to God? And so Rahner asks that basic question, but that question drives everything else. And so I think if you start with that question and then you begin where he begins, the doctrine of God, and then starts to unfold that through all the different loci, like a doctrine of man, doctrine of Christ, his doctrine of grace, and you move on through all of those things. Then you come to see, when you return back to his Trinitarian axiom, or you return back to the doctrine of the anonymous Christian, it's almost as if the cursory analyses are not even talking about the same thing, because you understand it so much more deeply. It's not really hard to understand either when you really unpack it, but not a lot of books are treating Rahner with this kind of thoroughgoing, organic polemic, and that's what I was trying to do.